The history of the British Empire is usually painted in broad, heroic strokes. We think of the thin red line at Waterloo, the desperate defence of Rorke's Drift, or the grand sweeping campaigns of the Peninsula. We picture ranks of disciplined soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, muskets levelled, facing a defined enemy on a defined field of battle. But there is another story, a darker chapter that was written not on the open plains of Europe or the dusty veldt of Africa, but in the claustrophobic, sun-scorched scrub of the Australian continent. This is a story that for over a century was deliberately written out of the history books, hidden behind the euphemisms of settlement and dispersal. It is the story of the British Army's longest, strangest, and perhaps most forgotten war. To understand this conflict, you have to strip away the modern image of Australia as a land of beaches and barbecues. You have to go back to the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Imagine the sensory shock for a young private recruited from the damp green slums of London or the misty highlands of Scotland. After a grueling sea voyage that could last half a year, he is dumped onto a shore that looks like nothing else on earth. The trees do not shed their leaves. They shed their bark. The animals defy categorization, hopping instead of running. The seasons are inverted, and the silence of the vast bushland is heavy, broken only by the screech of parrots or the drone of cicadas. In this alien landscape, the British soldier stands out with a perilous vibrancy. He is wearing the iconic wool tunic of the British regular, dyed in madder red. It is a uniform designed for the green fields of Europe, intended to help commanders identify their troops through the smoke of black powder. But here, against the muted greys, olives and browns of the eucalyptus forest, that red coat is not a badge of honour. It is a target. It screams his presence to an enemy he cannot see, an enemy who can move through the dry undergrowth without snapping a twig. This documentary is an investigation into that soldier's experience. We are going to dig into the regimental records, the governor's dispatches, and the oral histories of the First Nations people to reconstruct a military campaign that spanned nearly 100 years. This was not a police action. It was not merely a series of unfortunate skirmishes between farmers and locals. It was a war. It involved the deployment of over 25 different infantry regiments of the British line, including the 3rd, the 17th, the 40th, and the 99th Regiments of Foot. These were veteran units, some of whom had fought Napoleon, now tasked with enforcing the Crown's will on the other side of the world. For generations, the narrative has been that Australia was settled peacefully. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, or nobody's land, claimed that the continent was empty of ownership, waiting for the British to simply walk in and plant the flag. But the reality on the ground was violently different. As the colony expanded outward from Sydney Cove, pushing into the hunting grounds of the Eora, the Darawal, and the Wiradjuri nations, the British encountered organised, determined resistance. The Empire responded the only way it knew how. It militarised the frontier. We tend to remember the Redcoats in Australia as prison guards, standing bored sentry duty over chain gangs of convicts. And while that was part of their role, it was not the whole story. As the frontier pushed west, the Redcoats became the spearhead of invasion. They were sent to garrison remote outposts, to protect the rapidly expanding wool industry, and to conduct punitive expeditions against indigenous tribes deemed hostile to the Crown. This series will challenge the comfortable myth of the peaceful pioneer. We will see that the pastoral expansion of Australia was a military operation paid for with the blood of soldiers and the devastation of the world's oldest living culture. We will walk the ground of forgotten battlefields where muskets clashed with spears, and where the discipline of the British square met the guerrilla tactics of the bush. We will uncover the story of the redcoat in the bush, a soldier fighting a war he didn't understand, for a prize he would never own, against an enemy he could rarely find. This is the history of the war on Australia's frontier. To the commanders sitting in the cool stone barracks of Sydney or Hobart, the strategic situation seemed deceptively simple. They were the masters of the most powerful military machine on the planet, They had defeated the armies of India, they had humbled the French, and they possessed the logistical might of the Royal Navy. Against this, they faced an opponent with no standing army, no gunpowder, no iron, and no central government. On paper, it should have been a rout. It should have been a brief police action to disperse a few unruly natives before the business of empire building could continue. But war is never fought on paper. It is fought on the ground. And on this ground, the British advantage evaporated. The indigenous nations of Australia, the Eora, the Dharawal, the Wiradjuri, and hundreds of others, were not a disorganized rabble. They were the inheritors of a warrior tradition honed over tens of thousands of years. They knew every rock, every creek bed, and every ridgeline of their country. They understood the rhythms of the land, the movement of birds that signaled an intruder, and the way sound carried through the valleys. The British soldier was trained to fight in a specific way. He was a cog in a machine designed to deliver massed volleys of fire against a visible enemy formation. He was drilled to stand his ground, to load, present, and fire on command, trusting that the man next to him would do the same. But in the Australian bush, there were no enemy formations. There were no lines to break. The enemy simply did not exist in the way the British understood warfare. Early colonial accounts are filled with a specific kind of frustration and dread. Officers would report marching their men for days in pursuit of a raiding party, dragging their heavy equipment through steep ravines and tangled undergrowth, only to find nothing. They would burn a few empty huts in retaliation and turn back, only to be attacked on the return journey. Spears would fly from the darkness of the tree line, striking with terrifying accuracy and force. By the time the soldiers had wheeled around and levelled their muskets, the bush was silent again. The indigenous resistance leaders quickly identified the weaknesses of the European invaders. Men like Pemulwuy of the Eora people became legends, not just among their own people, but among the fearful settlers. In the 1790s, Pemulwuy led a campaign that can only be described as guerrilla warfare. He targeted the economic lifeblood of the colony. He burned crops, speared livestock, and attacked isolated parties of convicts and soldiers. He struck quickly and vanished. To the superstitious Irish convicts and the weary soldiers, he seemed supernatural. Reports circulated that he was immune to musket balls, a ghost who could not be killed. This type of warfare neutralized the technological superiority of the Redcoat. The standard issue weapon of the British infantry was the India-pattern brown Bess musket. It was a smoothbore firearm, meaning the barrel had no rifling. It was heavy, prone to misfiring in damp conditions, and famously inaccurate. Military manuals of the day suggested that firing at a single man at a distance of more than 80 yards was a waste of powder. It was a weapon designed for volley fire, where accuracy mattered less than the sheer weight of lead thrown into a mass of enemy troops. Against a single warrior moving swiftly through the trees, the brown Bess was almost useless. Compare this to the indigenous weaponry. A warrior with a woomera, a spear thrower that acts as a lever to increase velocity and range, could hit a moving target at over 100 yards with lethal force. The spear was silent. It did not give away the attacker's position with a puff of white smoke, and a skilled warrior could carry a bundle of spears and throw them in rapid succession, far faster than a soldier could reload his musket, a process that took 15 to 20 seconds, even for a well-drilled veteran. The psychological toll this took on the British garrisons was immense. They were fighting a phantom army. They were subjected to a constant, low-level stress that today we might recognize as combat fatigue. Sentry duty became a terrifying ordeal. A soldier standing guard at a remote outpost knew that at any moment, without hearing a sound, he could be struck down. The darkness of the Australian night, so different from the twilight of Europe, felt impenetrable. The British command struggled to adapt. They were bound by the rigid regulations of the Horse Guards in London. They insisted on uniforms that were totally unsuited to the climate and tactics that were suicidal in the terrain. But slowly, painfully, the realization dawned on the colonial governors. They were not dealing with a simple public order issue. They were engaged in a fight for control of the continent, against an enemy who was master of the environment. If the Redcoats were going to win, they would have to stop fighting like Europeans and start learning from the very people they were trying to conquer. They would have to descend into a war of shadows. This shadow was cast by the Australian bush itself. To the British mind, accustomed to the manicured hedgerows, clear-running streams, and defined seasons of the Northern Hemisphere, the Australian interior was a landscape of madness. It was often described in colonial journals as monotonous, melancholy, and hostile. For the Redcoat, the land was not just the battlefield, it was a third combatant, and often the most lethal one. Consider the physical reality of a soldier from the 40th Regiment of Foot, marching into the interior of New South Wales in the height of summer. He is outfitted for a campaign in Belgium. He wears a heavy wool tunic, thick felt shako on his head, and a stiff leather stock around his neck to keep his chin up. A piece of kit the soldiers bitterly called the dog collar. He is carrying 60 pounds of equipment, including a musket, bayonet, ammunition, water, and rations, and he is doing this in temperatures that frequently exceed 40 degrees Celsius or over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Heat stroke, recorded in the medical ledgers as apoplexy, was a constant killer. Men would simply drop dead on the march, their bodies unable to regulate the heat trapped by their European uniforms. Water was scarce and often brackish. The rivers in Australia do not behave like European rivers. They dry up into chains of stagnant ponds, or billabongs, which were often fouled by livestock. Dysentery and ophthalmia, a painful inflammation of the eyes caused by dust, and the relentless swarms of bushflies were rampant. The environment degraded the army's efficiency long before they ever saw an indigenous warrior. But the terrain offered more than just physical hardship. It offered a tactical nightmare. The Australian scrub is deceptive. It is not a dense tropical jungle, nor is it an open forest. It is a chaotic mix of eucalyptus trees with vertical leaves that offer no shade, tangled undergrowth, and sharp spinifex grass that cuts through trousers and skin. In this terrain, the rigid geometry of British military manoeuvres fell apart. You cannot form a square in a thicket of acacia. You cannot keep a line dressed when scrambling over sandstone escarpments. The bush broke the army into small, isolated fragments, vulnerable and blind. So, why were they there? What possessed the British Empire to push its soldiers into this green hell? The answer, as is so often the case in colonial history, was economic. It was the Golden Fleece. By the 1820s and 30s, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing back in England. The dark, satanic mills of Yorkshire and Lancashire had an insatiable hunger for wool. Australia, with its vast grassy plains, was perfectly commanded to feed that hunger. A new class of settler emerged, the squatter. These were men, often younger sons of the British gentry or ambitious emancipists, who moved their vast flocks of sheep beyond the official government boundaries, known as the limits of location. They were essentially land pirates. They had no legal title to the land they occupied, but they had the political weight of the wool industry behind them. They pushed deep into Aboriginal country, seizing waterholes and prime hunting grounds for their sheep. A single squatter might claim a run the size of an English county. This was an invasion of space on a massive scale. The sheep destroyed the yam daisies that were a staple food for the indigenous people. They muddied the waterholes, and the fences cut across ancient songlines and trade routes. The conflict was inevitable. The indigenous nations, facing starvation and the desecration of their land, retaliated. They speared the sheep, not just for food, but as a tactic of economic warfare to drive the invaders away. They attacked the isolated shepherds' huts. The squatters, in turn, demanded protection. They petitioned the governor, using their influence in London to demand that the king's troops defend their stolen assets. And so, the British Army found itself in a compromising and contradictory role. They were the enforcers of an unauthorized expansion. The governors often railed against the greed of the squatters, knowing that their rapacious land grabbing was causing the violence, yet they were compelled to send the Redcoats to protect them. The soldiers became the private security force for the wool barons. They were dispatched to remote outposts, tiny specks of imperial red in a sea of grey-green, tasked with holding the line against a people fighting for their very survival. The motive was profit, the method was brute force, and the result was a spiral of violence that would consume the frontier for decades. By 1824, the tension in the interior had reached a breaking point. The Wiradjuri nation, whose lands lay west of the Blue Mountains in what is now central New South Wales, faced an existential threat. The settlers were pouring into the Bathurst plains, their cattle and sheep trampling the delicate ecosystem that supported the Wiradjuri way of life. But unlike the scattered resistance of earlier years, the Wiradjuri response was organised, tactical, and devastating. They were led by a man named Windradyne. He is one of the great resistance leaders of history, though his name is barely known outside of Australia. Windradyne was not just a warrior, he was a diplomat and a strategist. He recognised that isolated attacks on shepherds would not be enough. To stop the invasion, he needed to strike at the settlers' sense of security. He organised coordinated raids on homesteads, burning buildings and driving off livestock, but often sparing the lives of those who had not committed specific crimes against his people. He was sending a message. This land is ours, and you are here on our sufferance. The settlers, terrified and outraged, demanded the government act. They didn't just want protection, they wanted retribution. Governor Thomas Brisbane, under immense pressure, took a step that transformed the conflict from a police matter into a declared war. On August 14, 1824, he declared martial law west of the Blue Mountains. This was a pivotal moment. The declaration of martial law effectively suspended the civil rights of the indigenous population. It gave the military and the settlers carte blanche to use lethal force without the need for warrants, trials, or evidence. It was, in effect, a license to kill. The 40th Regiment of Foot was deployed to the region, not to keep the peace, but to subjugate an enemy. What followed was a brutal campaign of attrition. The Redcoats, now operating under war conditions, swept through the bush, but even with the full authority of the Crown, they found Windradyne elusive. He moved his people through the rugged terrain, avoiding pitched battles. The soldiers, frustrated by their inability to bring the Wiradjuri to a proper fight, began to rely on terror tactics. They conducted night raids on sleeping camps. They targeted non-combatants. The distinction between a warrior and a civilian, already blurred in the minds of the soldiers, vanished entirely. One particular engagement highlights the savage nature of this phase of the war. A detachment of the 40th Regiment, acting on intelligence, surprised a group of Wiradjuri near the Bells Falls Gorge. Accounts of what happened next vary, but oral histories and settler diaries suggest a massacre where women and children were driven over the cliff edge to their deaths. Despite the brutality, the military campaign struggled to achieve a decisive victory. Windradyne remained at large, a symbol of defiance. It wasn't until late in 1824 that he decided to end the bloodshed. In a remarkable display of courage, he walked into the town of Parramatta, over 100 miles away, to meet the governor. He marched at the head of his warriors, wearing a hat with a sign that read, "Peace," stuck into the brim. He had not been defeated in battle. He had chosen to negotiate to save his people from annihilation. The Bathurst War was a turning point. It proved that the British Army could not easily suppress indigenous resistance through conventional means. But it also established a grim precedent. The government had shown it was willing to suspend the rule of law and unleash the full force of the military to secure the frontier. The lessons learned here, the use of mounted units, the reliance on surprise dawn raids, and the total war against the population, would be exported to other colonies. As the frontier moved south to the island of Tasmania, these tactics would be taken to their darkest logical conclusion. If the Bathurst War was a conflict over land, the war in Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, was a war of extermination. By the late 1820s, the island colony had descended into chaos. The conflict here is known as the Black War, and it remains arguably the most intense and violent war ever fought on Australian soil. The Palawa people, fighting for their lives against a rapidly expanding population of settlers and convicts, had brought the colony to a standstill. The Palawa were masters of ambush. They struck isolated homesteads with terrifying precision, killing settlers and disappearing before help could arrive. The psychological terror was absolute. Settlers barricaded themselves in their homes, looping muskets through slots cut in the walls. The colony's economy was collapsing. The governor, George Arthur, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, realized that the piecemeal approach of sending out patrols was failing. He decided to implement a military solution on a scale never before seen in the British colonies. In 1830, Governor Arthur conceived a plan that was as ambitious as it was desperate. It was called the Black Line. The concept was drawn straight from the manuals of European grand strategy. He would form a human chain across the settled districts of the island, a cordon sweeping from north to south to drive the remaining clans into the Tasman Peninsula, a natural cul-de-sac where they could be captured and contained. This was not a minor police operation. It was a total mobilization of the colony. Arthur marshalled over 2,200 men. This force included every available soldier from the 40th, 57th and 63rd Regiments, alongside police, freed convicts and settlers. It was the largest domestic military force ever assembled in Australia. The cost was astronomical, consuming half of the colony's entire annual budget. Imagine the scene as this operation commenced. A line of men, stretching over hundreds of miles, attempting to move in unison through some of the most rugged terrain on Earth. They were issued with thousands of rounds of ammunition, rations for weeks, and handcuffs. The orders were strict: maintain the line, keep a distance of 40 yards between men, and sweep the forest clean. Drums beat to signal the advance. Fires were lit at night to prevent the enemy from slipping through the gaps. But the British military machine was once again grinding gears against the reality of the Australian bush. The terrain of Tasmania is unforgiving. Dense, temperate rainforests, deep ravines, and freezing highlands. The line broke almost immediately. Officers lost contact with their flanks. Provisions went missing. Soldiers, exhausted and disoriented, stumbled through the undergrowth, making enough noise to alert every living creature for miles. For the Palawa warriors, the Black Line must have seemed like a clumsy, lumbering beast. They watched from the high ridges, unseen. They slipped through the gaps in the line at night, often passing silently between the sleeping fires of the soldiers. There are accounts of warriors shadowing the troops, mocking their clumsiness. After 7 weeks of grueling marches, the great trap was finally snapped shut on the Tasman Peninsula. The result was a military humiliation. The massive dragnet, which had cost the Empire a fortune and exhausted its army, had captured exactly 2 people, an old man and a young boy. The rest of the clans had simply ghosted away. In the press, the Black Line was ridiculed as a farce. But while it was a tactical failure, it was a strategic masterstroke of psychological warfare. It demonstrated to the Palawa that there was nowhere to hide. The British could summon a force that could scour the entire island. They could turn the very landscape against them. The relentless pressure of the line, combined with years of disease and violence, broke the resistance. In the aftermath, a lay preacher named George Augustus Robinson was able to go into the bush and negotiate the surrender of the remaining clans. They were not defeated in battle. They were exhausted, terrified, and promised sanctuary. They surrendered in the belief they would be allowed to remain on their lands. Instead, they were exiled to a windswept island in the Bass Strait, where neglect and disease completed what the muskets had started. The Black Line remains a chilling monument to the lengths the empire would go to secure its frontier, a sledgehammer brought down to crush a shadow. As the frontier rolled westward, the pattern of violence repeated itself, but the geography dictated new tactics. In Western Australia, the Swan River Colony, modern-day Perth, was established in 1829. Unlike the penal colonies of the East, this was a free settlement for gentry, but the result for the Noongar people was the same: dispossession. By 1834, relations between the settlers and the Pinjarup Noongar people had deteriorated into open conflict. The Pinjarup were renowned for their physical stature and their fierce defence of their land along the Murray River. They had raided the flour mill, speared livestock, and killed a soldier of the 21st Regiment. The settlers lived in a state of siege, unable to leave their homes without armed escort. The governor of Western Australia was James Stirling, a naval captain by trade. He was a man of action, and he decided that a demonstration of overwhelming force was required to break the Pinjarup power. This would not be a long, drawn-out campaign like the Black Line. It would be a surgical strike. On the morning of October 28, 1834, Stirling assembled a force of 25 men. This included soldiers of the 63rd Regiment, mounted police, and armed settlers. Stirling's plan relied on speed and surprise. He knew the Pinjarup were camped by the Murray River, a place of significance and safety for them. The British force arrived at the riverbank just an hour after dawn. The morning mist was still clinging to the water. The camp was waking up. Men, women, and children were present. Stirling divided his force. He sent a detachment of mounted police to circle around and cut off any retreat, while he led the main body of troops in a direct charge. When the shooting started, it was chaotic. The Pinjarup warriors grabbed their spears and tried to hold off the attackers to allow their families to escape into the river. But the soldiers had the high ground of the riverbank. As the Noongar people plunged into the water to swim across, they became slow-moving targets. This was known as pot shooting. Stirling's journal describes a sharp skirmish, but the details reveal a massacre. The soldiers fired volley after volley into the people in the water. The Pinjarup fought back desperately. Captain Ellis of the mounted police was knocked from his horse by a spear and later died of his wounds. But spears were no match for the crossfire of muskets from both banks. The Battle of Pinjarra lasted only an hour. By the time the smoke cleared, the river was running red. The official British report claimed 15 to 20 Indigenous dead. Aboriginal oral history puts the number much higher, likely between 60 and 80, including many women and children. Stirling declared it a victory. He warned the survivors that if they ever raised a spear against a white man again, he would return and wipe them out completely. The Pinjarra massacre broke the back of the resistance in the region. It was a brutal lesson in the mathematics of colonial power. A small, mobile, well-armed force could decapitate a tribe in a single morning. This event highlights the evolving nature of the Redcoats' role. They were becoming less like traditional infantry and more like a paramilitary strike force. They were learning that in the vast spaces of Australia, mobility was key. The heavy infantry tactics were being discarded in favour of mounted operations, anticipating the light horse traditions that would become famous a century later. Pinjarra was the prototype for the frontier massacres that would continue to haunt the Australian interior for another 50 years. By the mid-19th century, the mood in London was changing. The British Empire was looking at its balance sheets and frowning. The cost of maintaining thousands of regular troops in the Australian colonies was exorbitant. Furthermore, the nature of the enemy had shifted. The great nations of the southeast had been broken or dispersed. The frontier was moving north into Queensland and the vast, arid interior. This was country even more hostile than the forests of Tasmania, and it required a different kind of soldier. In 1870, the final detachment of the British Army marched to the docks in Sydney, boarded their ships, and sailed for home. The Redcoats were gone, but the war was not over. In fact, it was about to enter its most lethal phase. The departure of the regulars signalled a shift from warfare to dispersal. The colonial governments, now largely self-governing, were free to handle the Aboriginal problem without the oversight of the Colonial Office in London. They replaced the British regular with a force that was terrifyingly effective, the native police. The colonial commanders had finally learned the lesson that the Redcoats struggled with for decades. Only an Indigenous warrior can catch an Indigenous warrior. They began to recruit young Aboriginal men, often from tribes distant to the area of operations, put them in uniforms, armed them with Snyder Enfield carbines, and placed them under the command of white officers. This was the ultimate weaponization of the frontier. These troopers possessed the tracking skills, the bushcraft, and the endurance that the British infantrymen lacked. They could move through the scrub without water for days. They could read the ground like a map, and tragically, traditional tribal rivalries were exploited to turn them into ruthless hunters of other indigenous groups. The violence perpetrated by the native police in the late 19th century eclipsed the battles of the Redcoat era. It was a war of secret massacres, carried out far beyond the gaze of the press or the law. But the foundation for this ultimate conquest had been laid by the British Army. It was the 3rd, the 40th, and the 99th Regiments that had shattered the initial organised resistance. They had garrisoned the key points, protected the first waves of squatters, and enforced the legal fiction of British sovereignty when it was most vulnerable. The Redcoats' role was the shock of capture. They were the blunt instrument used to break open the continent. They built the roads, the bridges, and the forts, like Victoria Barracks in Sydney, that remain today as stone sentinels of their presence. They brought the discipline and logistics of European warfare to a land that defied it, and in doing so, they paved the way for the pastoral industry to swallow the continent. But for the individual soldier, the legacy was often a lonely grave. Hundreds of British soldiers died in Australia, not just from spears, but from heat, disease, and accidents. They are buried in forgotten cemeteries in country towns, their headstones weathered by the harsh sun, their service records filed away in Kew Archives, London, under colonial service. They were the foot soldiers of an invasion they barely understood, fighting a war that their own government preferred to call by any other name. So why is this war forgotten? Why, when we walk past the war memorials in every Australian town, do we see names from Gallipoli, the Somme, Tobruk, and Vietnam, but never names from the Hawkesbury, the Bathurst Plains, or the Black Line? Historian W.E.H. Stanner called it the Great Australian Silence. For over a century, the reality of the frontier wars was actively suppressed. To acknowledge it as a war would be to acknowledge that the land was not terra nullius, that it was not empty but owned and defended. To call it a war would mean admitting that the foundation of modern Australia was built not just on sheep's wool and gold dust, but on a campaign of military conquest. It was a war that didn't fit the national narrative. Australia likes to see itself as the underdog, the battler, the gallant volunteer fighting for freedom on foreign shores. The story of professional British soldiers and armed settlers crushing an indigenous population with superior weaponry is an uncomfortable reflection in the mirror. It is a story of massacres, of poisoned flour, of women and children driven off cliffs. It lacks the glory of conventional warfare, but the numbers tell the story. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 20,000 Indigenous people died in conflict on the frontier, though the real number is likely much higher. On the other side, between 2,000 and 2,500 Europeans, soldiers, police, and settlers were killed. To put that in perspective, that is more white casualties than were suffered in the Boer War, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War combined. Today, the silence is slowly breaking. The War Memorial in Canberra is beginning to recognise these conflicts. Modern archaeology is uncovering the forensic evidence of the battles, and the oral histories of the First Nations people, passed down through generations of trauma, are finally being heard as historical testimony. When we look back at the Redcoat in Australia, we see a complex figure. He was an invader, an enforcer of imperial will, and a killer. But he was also a pawn in a much larger game, sweating in his wool tunic, terrified of the silent bush, dying of thirst in a land he couldn't comprehend. The war on Australia's frontier was the first war of the Australian nation. It defined the borders, the economy, and the demographics of the continent. It is a history written in blood on the eucalyptus leaves, a story of two civilizations colliding in the silence of the vast ancient continent. It is a story that demands to be remembered, not as a footnote of settlement, but as the violent, tragic, and defining conflict that it was. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.